times where he felt like he was a prisoner in his room or in his bed, more than a patient who was being cared for.
Dick was in the very back of Riverdale Hospital almost, you know, unable to be found, and he found people who could support him. I mean, that's really amazing.
We made a list of some things that he wanted to achieve, and the one that was at the top of his list was to get out of the hospital.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of DNet, the Disability Network. I'm Susan Pettit-Crossman. This week we'll take a look at the effect that living in an institution has on people with disabilities. Until recently, if you were disabled, in all likelihood you would spend at least part of your life, probably all of it, in an institution. While these places may try to provide the best for their residents, they are often forced to make compromises. Most are not designed to provide highly personalized individual care, so many residents wind up feeling frustrated or resentful. Today we'll hear the story of Dick Hewston and his experience in a chronic care hospital. Hewston was told he would spend the rest of his life there. As it turned out, that's not what happened. The story is told by Dick and friends who formed a support group for him, as well as by a story that Dick wrote about his experience.
I spent all my life at home with my mother and father. My mother looked after me. I was happy there. My mother had a heart attack about 5 years ago. She had to go into the hospital. She was in the hospital 5 times. One night, the hospital phoned, and my father told me my mother passed away. After my mother died, I was supposed to go into the hospital. My cousin put me in without asking me. I told them I didn't want to go in. She told me my father was too old to look after me, and I would only be there for a couple of weeks. I was there for 5 years.
As his stay at Riverdale was extended and extended, it seems that he was unfortunately developing a bit of a hostile relationship with some of the nursing staff that was closest to him. And what their motivations were, whether they were ever acting punitively towards him, I do not know, but I know that he had complaints about instances of being left in his bed for such extended periods of time that he would develop bed sores. I know he had complaints about having wetted himself because bedpans weren't provided to him in a timely enough fashion. And essentially he had complaints about ill and irresponsible treatment his way. And there were times where he felt like he was a prisoner in his room or in his bed, more than a patient who was being cared for.
If somebody got mad at you in the institution, Dick, what would happen?
I cannot get up and tell you.
They wouldn't get you up? What else?
You come in one day, I feel wet, poop all over the bed.
Your bed was wet, there was poop on the bed.
Yeah.
They just leave you like that?
Yeah.
I asked if I could take him down to the cafeteria so that we could talk more privately. And the nurses said no, they'd have to phone his cousin for permission for him to leave the floor. So he didn't even have the right to move off that floor without family permission. And his cousin wasn't in, so they wouldn't let him go to the cafeteria. He was denied the privilege.
Somebody else was determining what he could do and couldn't do.
Some of the things Dick couldn't have during the 5 years in the institution were a telephone, the right to come and go as he wished, when he wished, or even a power chair.
Again, something that would give Dick independence, and now that he's out of the hospital, does give him independence. He's able to move around quite independently, but that was something that the hospital felt was unacceptable, and felt he'd never be able to do.
Well, they felt he was incapable, and I think what they said, Dick, was that you had a perceptual handicap. You would never be able to learn how to use a power wheelchair.
How'd it feel getting into a chair that you could operate yourself for the first time?
Good.
Good.
Yeah.
The most fundamental constraint was the constraint on his self-esteem. He was made to feel like a less than full person by virtue of the care he received at Riverdale. And more than anything else, it wasn't that he was in shackles. It wasn't that he was, there were no horror stories, I think, in terms of abusive behavior, nothing like that. But his autonomy was never respected, his self-esteem was never respected, and in some respects, in a physical manner, he wasn't cared for in the best way possible.
This was a formerly happy, joyous, fun-loving guy who we saw just shrivel up and, as you say, crumble to a point where he was afraid of a lot of things. And what motivated me was seeing the way he was, and knowing that this person was that way because he lived in the community, and this is what the institution was doing to him. And so I just couldn't stand to see him shrivel up and die in the hospital the way so many others are.
Riverdale's ombudsman told us if Dick was in bed for long periods of time, it must have been something to do with his medical situation. She said she wasn't aware of Dick being left in a soiled bed. She also said Richard was assessed for a power chair, and he was deemed not capable of operating the chair safely.
I think one of the most important things for people to realize, first of all, people that are in institutions, is that they do have a choice. There are options. They're not always easily available, but you have to find them. You have to fight for them.
So how would you feel? Yeah, somebody told you had to go back to Riverdale.
I'm going to go to first.
You go to court first.
In the fall of 1987, a support group was formed to help Dick Hewston. Heather Willis is one of the organizers of the group. Both Heather and group member Ed Wadley had lived in institutions before and could relate to some of Dick's experiences. Dick introduced Mary Savage to the group. She had been coming to the hospital as a volunteer advocate for the rights of people with disabilities, and she and Dick had become friends. Kelly Ratchford, a social worker, came to the group's meetings as well. Paul Rosen, who became Dick's lawyer, also sat in on some meetings. Mary Savage recalls the situation that Dick was in.
Dick was in the very back of Riverdale Hospital almost, you know, unable to be found, and he found people who could support him. I mean, that's really amazing.
It was a year before my support group came. They didn't like the way I was treated. A couple of months after they got there, they talked about it. I talked to the group about everything.
We sat with Dick and said, this group is for you. What are your goals? We're here to help you with your goals. And so we made a list of some things that he wanted to achieve, and the one that was at the top of his list was to get out of the hospital. Then we said, okay, that's a good long-term goal, and we'll work towards that. But what are some other things that you'd like to do? One of them was to go to a hockey game. You'd never been to a hockey game before. Then we started to brainstorm and think about some of the things that would make his life more enjoyable, would make him more empowered. And
while he was still at Riverdale.
While he was still at Riverdale, because we knew realistically that that wasn't going to happen overnight. So two of the things were, number one, to get him a telephone that he could use, because he didn't have telephone, quote, privileges at Riverdale. And the other thing was to look into getting him a power chair so that he could be independently mobile.
It's an odd situation when you consider that something as readily available to the general public as a telephone is considered this gift or privilege within the institutional setting. And of course there's all the issues around control and responsibility and power that telephone gave Dick, and he of course recognized that too.
No, please. No. Well, okay.
What we ended up doing, because we couldn't go through the formal channels to get him a power chair, the government being what it is, you have to have that sort of thing approved by a team of professionals, and seeing as they wouldn't, we ended up putting the best of two power chairs together, an old one of Ed's and an old one of another friend of mine. My husband is quite handy, and he was able to put the best of the two together, and we just did it ourselves. And the challenge then was to be able to try and get the help and the time for Dick to be able to practice.
Go towards the table. Okay, there we go. Anthony's ready.
Both Ed and I had been there. We'd both lived in institutions, and I spent 8 years in an institution myself as a kid. And I could really relate to what was going on with Dick, and both Ed and I have undergone our own empowerment, and we know what it's about. And so to help someone explore that for themselves is really exciting.
My appreciation of Dick's capabilities underwent for me a bit of a transformation when I saw him for the first time in the presence of his support group. My original dealings with Richard were always done with the assistance of Kelly Ratchford, his social worker. I had trouble when I first met Richard understanding his requests because of his disability. His ability to articulate words is not that phenomenal.
Maybe you can let them know what phone numbers you would like them to have. You want everybody in your support group's phone numbers, stuff like that.
There was a perception in my own mind that he needed intensive care, and that he had extremely special requirements, and indeed may have required adult supervision. I was wrong. When I first saw Richard with the support group, it dawned on me in the sense of I could feel it in my body and in a very profound way that this was a person that was suffering only from physical disability, and that he had a very strong free will, and he had quite a vibrant mind. And I don't know why it took me until I first saw him with a support group, but obviously it was a place where he was comfortable enough to assert himself and comfortable enough to be himself and to perhaps come out of a psychological shell that he felt imposed or he imposed upon himself at the hospital.
After I left the institution, I've never been back, and I've no desire to go back. Which isn't to say...
Actually, we're feeling afraid in a way to go back there, feeling uncomfortable just to go back and visit Dick. We both felt it, wheeling towards there in Wheel-Trans, just feeling those same old feelings of, boy, we're back in this situation that oppressed us in our past. And we both felt it. We both mentioned that. Yep.
What does this support group mean to you after all this time? What is... A lot of friends?
Yeah. Behind
Behind you, yeah.
One of the main philosophies, I guess, behind a support group is that people are there because they want to be there. When somebody is living in an institution or even in the community but has to rely on any number of professionals to be involved in their day-to-day life, those people that are around that person are there because they're being paid to be there. Mm-hmm. And one of the whole ideas about a support group is that we're here because we want to be here.
Initially, Dick Hewston's support group concentrated on their short-term goals, helping him to acquire the things he wanted: access to a telephone, the ability to come and go as he pleased, and use of a power chair. As we heard earlier, the support group solved the power chair problem themselves. But overall, they felt they weren't making much headway. The group was further frustrated by efforts by some members of his family to have him declared mentally incompetent.
The other thing, of course, is the legal issues that have happened as well, and there's been several, anywhere from not allowing you to use Wheel-Trans by yourself to trying to get you labeled mentally incompetent. And those have been challenges which have only been recently resolved, that have gone on for a few years. So there's been many challenges along the way that have distracted us from the main goal, which was to try and get him out of the hospital, and you know, either with problems in the group or being distracted by legal obstacles. And
our whole focus was on getting him off his incompetence. I mean, we spent at least 2 or 3 years in the group. It's a wonder we ever got him out of Riverdale, because all the energy was going to fighting the legal battles, eh, Dick? You know, and that was horrendous, absolutely.
Richard was not a committed patient at the Riverdale Hospital. He wasn't a ward of the state. He was essentially no different than a patient in theory at any other hospital. And it was always our position that as a competent human being, he should be free to discharge himself from the hospital if he ever felt that his best interest demanded treatment or care or residency elsewhere. Now, again, the hospital had a slightly different position because their concern was that if Richard left the hospital and harm came his way, someone may look towards them as his protector or guardian, and again may look towards them for some form of redress in the event that harm came his way. And so they, I think, wanted to keep the doors closed essentially and keep him there, even though legally Richard was free to come and go as he wished, subject to any constraints that he may have agreed to.
At some point, we finally said, I don't know what it was, but we finally said, this is it. Let's just work on getting you out of there instead of trying to make things bearable for you there. You know, we at the same time were trying to concentrate on accessing different options other than the institution, and every time we did, we were faced with, you were too old or you weren't able to direct your own care. And then somebody came up with the idea of Mary Center, and it just went bang, bang, bang from there. And very quickly. Yeah.
I was nervous.
You were very nervous, eh?
One Sunday morning in November last year, I was a wee bit nervous. The hospital didn't know I was moving out that day. The group wanted it kept quiet. In the afternoon, they came up to my room, and then my lawyer came.
On the Sunday morning, I met with Heather and Paul Willis, 2 members of Richard's support group, and Kelly Ratchford, Richard's social worker. And we originally met at a donut shop just outside of Riverdale Hospital. A real air of cloak and dagger espionage sort of permeated the air. And
I was so nervous I forgot my driver's license at home, but I was bound and determined to drive you away from there. It's a good thing we didn't get stopped.
We went up to Richard's room, and he was in a terribly excited mood, and we packed his suitcase. And on a few occasions, nurses would look in and sort of, you could see they were a bit uncertain as to what was happening. After Richard's bags were packed, we carried them down to the van that was waiting for him.
He's coming down next. Decided to take some stuff down first.
The concern was that if we had advised them at the outset as to Richard's intentions, they may physically try to prohibit him from removing his belongings. There was a bit of a scurry at the nursing station, as I recall, and somewhat uncertain attitude on their part as to whether Richard was entitled to go, and they essentially advised us that we should wait, and perhaps we should do it the next day when more senior personnel were available. And I said, here's my card. You can have your more senior personnel call me. He's leaving now. We wheeled Richard around, pressed the open on the elevator. Anxious moments of waiting for the elevator to arrive because it took a few minutes, as I recall, and our concern was that they may actually physically impede Richard egressing the hospital, but it didn't happen. I guess the combination of having some support, members of Richard's support group, his social worker, and his legal counsel present deterred the hospital from taking any capricious steps that they may have considered.
Sure.
You okay?
Truth be told, it wasn't myself or his social worker or his support group that inspired Richard to actually make the decision to leave Riverdale Hospital. It was Richard's continual requests, read that badgering to the rest of his support community around him that motivated us to realize that not only was it a good idea, but it could be done. Richard wanted it, and there was no logistical reason why it couldn't be done. I can say without any hesitation that the one person in the world that is responsible for Richard Hewston leaving Riverdale Hospital is Richard Hewston.
Oh, you need to be pulled up the worst way.
So, yippee? Yeah. You're out?
Yeah.
You happy?
Yeah.
I was still worried and nervous that someone would take me back to the hospital. But when I got in, everybody said, "Cool down, cool down."
I came into my office early the next morning on the Monday and was inundated with frantic messages from legal counsel for Riverdale. And I advised counsel that if they had any inquiries or disputes with how Richard affected his release or discharge from Riverdale Hospital, and my view always was, take it up with Richard. He's a competent human being, and I'm sure he can respond to your questions in a satisfactory manner. It's his decision, and if you have a dispute, take it up with him.
So were they shocked?
What was you say?
Yes. Trapped in the composter. What a thing to happen. Nobody's moving. Here they go, Richard. That looks like a daddy or a mommy or no, it's a little baby. You enjoy that? Yeah. We don't get that every morning here. No. One of the biggest changes I've seen in Dick over the time I've known him is his social competence. He's so much better in a group. He speaks, his timing in a conversation is much better. I think that's one of the biggest things. Also, his use of the wheelchair, having a wheelchair is an amazing freedom for him.
One of your biggest challenges was learning how to make decisions, because you'd never had the choice before. So very often we would put you in a position where we would force you to make a decision.
That kind of behavior is the behavior you learned over 4 years at the hospital, or 5 years at the hospital. Because you weren't allowed to have your own ideas. You weren't allowed to have your own things to be done. So, you're forced into that position, and now it's a little difficult to get out of that now. Recognizing you do have that freedom.
I think another thing that I've learned from is the power of people joining together. That out of a small group, the things we have done, I truly didn't believe he would ever get out of Riverdale when we started this, because the odds were so high.
If you could see the change in Richard from who he was when he was at Riverdale to who he is at the Mary Center, and then you factor in that it's costing less money for the state for him to be at the Mary Center than it was at Riverdale, there's no rationale for people with long-term health disabilities, if they can be outside of a hospital environment, that's where they should be.
I like it here. I'm making more friends, but most of all, I'm making up my own mind about how I want to live.
The only constraints on a person in a hospital is the practical constraints of, are they capable of locomoting themselves in and out of the door? There are no legal constraints on someone in Richard Hewston's position. They can leave if they want to leave and if they're capable of leaving. And they're certainly capable of leaving as long as they get assistance from support groups outside.
In many ways, Dick Hewston's experience while he was living in an institution is not unique, but there are alternatives. It's the support of people that can make a difference. If you have a story about life in an institution, we'd like to hear from you. Write to us. That's our show. I'm Susan Pettit-Crossman. Now, here's our address. Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6. Or you can fax us at 416-975-5636.